Hey everyone, welcome to another interview. I am joined today by the Reverend Elizabeth Edman. How are you going?
Great.
Yes, I was really happy to have you here with us today. We're excited that this interview is happening and you're able to join us from across the seas.
I'm extremely thrilled to be here, Liam. I have tremendous respect for campus ministry. I did campus ministry for a while, and it's great work. And and so if your students are anything like the students that I worked with, my hope is that we'll get some really interesting conversation that'll go, even beyond what you and I talk about here.
Yeah, that's what we're hoping for, and I'm sure that will be the case. So for those who don't know, Liz Edman is an Episcopal priest and political strategist who's been igniting people's understanding of Christianity and queer life for more than 25 years. She has lived and worked on the front lines of the most salient contemporary issues where religion meets sexuality, serving as an inner-city hospital chaplain to people with HIV/AIDS from 1989 to 1995, helping craft political and communication strategies for marriage equality efforts, and persevering for almost 2 decades to become an openly queer priest in the Episcopal Church. Her writing has appeared all over, and particularly today, we are discussing her book, Queer Virtue, what LGBT people know about the church and know about life and love, and how it can revitalize the church and Christianity. I botched the subtitle, but Queer Virtue. I was so good. I realized I had it here, but I'm like, no, I won't be able to see that. I'll write it on my notes, and then I missed 2 words.
That subtitle too. I'm just saying.
All right. Yeah, I'll nail it again. What LGBTQ people know about life and love, and how it can revitalize Christianity. There you go.
Well done.
I slipped the church into my, when I wrote it out. I don't know where that came from. Something subliminal. It's like, anyway, that's the book we're discussing. So, yeah, there we go. Well, speaking of the book, would you want to give us a little bit of an overview of the book and anything particularly that you're hoping readers will take from it?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think it's helpful to know kind of why I wrote it, and basically, as you mentioned, I've been working in the intersection of politics and religion for a long time, both as a priest and as a political strategist. And so what I know from my experience is that sort of religious intolerance of queer people continues to be and to fuel the biggest drag on our justice movement. And so that concerned me as a political strategist. I often also see this emanating as a kind of spiritual violence that I think does immense damage to queer souls. So that's been a concern of mine for a long time, wanting to address that. At the same time, as a priest in the Episcopal Church and a member of mainline denominations in the U.S., I have long observed that on the Christian left here, as we've made progress in, celebrating the lives of LGBTQ people, very often the churches have not been great about articulating why we know that matters to do. And as a result of that, very often on the Christian left still, our proclamation around these issues can be tepid. Even as churches increasingly are really jumping in to do the right thing, still kind of the message is a little bit softer than what I think it could be. So all of this came together for me, and what I really became convinced of is that a gospel that would be good for the queers would also be good for the church. And so that's what this book is an effort to frame the gospel in that way. And then you ask what I hope that people will take away from the book. The book basically makes 2 overarching points. One is that queer people, in my experience, live lives of high moral caliber. Let me say that differently. I think that queer experience itself demands a lived response of high moral caliber. So queer people possess a kind of virtue according to terms that Christianity itself sets. I identify in the book this ethical path, which is common to queer people and to Christians. And there's no accident to me that the ethics in both of these worlds are so similar, because I see this queerness at work in the Christian tradition. So based on that, I think that queer people are sort of more in touch with our own queer ethical path. And I think that the church could learn a lot about how to be the church more effectively with greater impact by paying attention to queer experience and learning from queer experience.
Fantastic. And we'll get to that more soon, because that was something I really loved about the book. But I was thinking, like, writing a book is a long process. I'm not sure exactly how long you were working on this, but it doesn't happen overnight. And then a lot can change in the world in that time. And then a book is out there, and then a lot can change in the world in a short amount of time. And this book's been out about a year. And in that time, we've seen the Trump elected in the US. We've seen 100 days to that presidency. On the flip side, like Moonlight won Best Picture. So like, we've had some good.
Right. Right.
To what degree do you think the current climate has shaped the reception of the book? And maybe how do you think it affects the book's vitality?
Yeah, I love this question so much. You know, it goes to the heart of kind of these competing trends that you see going on in the religious world and in the secular world, right? So Trump and Moonlight all by themselves, right, are such a vivid example of different, you know, different people in our world moving in different directions. So queer people continue to make progress in the secular world. You know, Moonlight is this gorgeous example of you know, like this beautiful exploration of intersectional identity. And in the secular world, we're making greater and greater strides in understanding different aspects of our lives and how they inform each other, you know, often in really beautiful ways, and sometimes in really, really hard ways. But we keep digging deeply into that. So when you see that done so beautifully and touching people's hearts so much, it makes the dissonance with what people see going on in Christianity all the more stark. You know, one of the things that distresses me, and I talk about this a bit in the book, is that it seems that the right wing of Christianity has largely won the war in convincing people broadly that Christianity is, you know, anti-sex, anti-queer, and this has a huge impact on the Christian tradition as a faith tradition, and it absolutely has an impact on political discourse that affects LGBTQ people. Here in the U.S. right now, we're in the midst of big conversation about what are called religious freedom laws. And the idea, these are laws that are basically designed to exempt churches from you know, anti-discrimination laws that affect everybody else. We've got a huge issue right now with you know, states passing laws that make it harder for trans kids to go to the bathroom. You know, I mean, and that's a, you know, good example of an issue where you've got religion that's kind of in bed with politics in a way that does real damage to LGBTQ people. It's basically politics wrapped up in what I would say are allegedly Christian issues. So you know, the book lands in the middle of this, right? And while there are these kind of divergent trends that appear to be diverging more and more and more, truth is this tension has been going on for my entire adult life. And in fact, the book emerged out of that. So my hope is that the book will continue to be relevant. There's no question that the folks who are picking up the book are people who are trying to make sense out of precisely that this tension, and particularly people who identify as Christian or queer people who continue to struggle with the spiritual violence that we receive as a result of that tension. My hope is that at some point this book will be utterly like past tense. Like, oh yeah, we remember, very historical, yeah, we remember, oh yeah, we remember when that was an issue, and I mean, that would be just the best outcome. But I think we're not there. I think we're not there yet.
Yeah. You don't come across too many authors who are hoping for their own irrelevance, but I think this is one of those cases where it's more that it'll have succeeded, and that'll be quite beautiful. Yeah. So one thing I really loved about your book is that it isn't a work of apologetics seeking to encourage churches to accept and affirm LGBTQ people. Now, there's obviously a place for that. But maybe, even as you say that in some time we won't need this book, maybe we're getting to the point that certain communities don't need that form of kind of work. What I really appreciated was your book's argument, as you mentioned before, that the queer community is uniquely suited to revitalise progressive Christianity, and that the path of queer virtue is one that Christians can embrace if they desire a more robust way of living and performing their faith in public. Could you expand a little on how this realization developed through your own life, your ministry, and your experience in advocacy?
Yeah, my perspective on this really started, I talk about this a little bit in the book, but it really started simply with the experience, even before I was ordained, being in the church, preaching, doing pastoral counseling with folks, where I'd be doing something that was explicitly Christian, I'd be digging into the gospel, right? And, when you're writing a sermon, very often you're like, what's a good anecdote that sort of makes the point here? How can I paint this as a picture? And the anecdotes that would come to me always, were not always, a lot of the time were based on my experience in the LGBTQ community, And I reached a point where I sort of had to put that down as this primary lens, because it just became such an easy kind of go-to, right? I had an interesting example of that when I was scheduled to preach at my church the Sunday after Matthew Shepard had been killed. And I was already scheduled to preach, but then, he was murdered, and it was national news and international news, and I clearly needed to speak to that. So I'm working with the text, and all of a sudden, as I was sitting in my window like this, with a street outside, there was this evangelical preacher who was preaching, and I could hear him. And I thought in my head, I didn't know what he was preaching, but I thought, you just assume, well, he's probably preaching some kind of hate. And I hated that was my immediate response, and then I thought, well, I could go outside and I could listen to him. And if that is what he's doing, I could confront him, And then I realized that the very idea of doing that was frightening. I'm writing a sermon about someone who's just been murdered, and we've made a lot of progress since the 90s when that happened, and it would have been a dangerous thing to do, to go out on the street like that. And there was just so much that I saw in that moment about the power of fear, and the power of the gospel to breed fear if it is mishandled, or abused. So that's where a lot of this starts for me, is in that kind of experience. And then I started to pay attention to the ethic that I was seeing lived out in queer community, and it bears saying that not all queer people live this, grand ethic, there are lots of us who, just flat out refuse to walk this path at all. But it's amazing to me how dedicated so many queer people are to living a kind of ethical path in our community. And so when I talk about this valuable ethic that I see as a kind of a community-wide ethic. So I began to see this playing out as early as way back in the day, back in the 90s. So, for instance, my former partner was one of the founding members of the Lesbian Avengers, very early member of the Lesbian Avengers, and they were planning an action. This is a direct action group that's sprung up in along in the wake of ACT UP and all the street activism. So the Avengers were planning an action out in Queens because there was an effort there to remove any LGBT books from the curriculum. And so there was this big action they had planned. And one of the slogans that they came up with, direct action, you need a really catchy chant, right? Oh, yeah. And one of the chants that they were coming up with was, "Don't let preachers be our teachers." Mm-hmm. Well, my former partner was in the ordination process, and she sort of gently steps in and she's like, "I know why we're chanting. I know why you want to chant this, but I just got to say that preaching itself isn't supposed to be this violent thing, and I can't chant something like that because this is what I'm called to do." Mm. And the whole conversation shifted. They put that down, not because they changed their minds about the what they knew was this spiritual violence at work in these preaching, but because they saw her and her experience mattered to them. And I've seen that. I tell this story, a similar story at an ACT UP meeting about this guy who stands up to defend the Pope, right? But I've seen that again and again, where even radical queer activists who I'm sure would, be horrified ever to be associated with Christianity in some way, were able to live into an ethical posture that required enormous integrity and compassion and the ability to see the other in their midst.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. That's really, really helpful. So this kind of also touches on, to an extent, a difference between kind of inclusion and transformation within the church. That way of thinking. So that that while the initial step of the affirming and welcoming and including, which as you mentioned before, is becoming more and more prominent. That's great to include people in the worshiping community, but that should be just an initial step. That following that, the church should seek to open itself to those who have been included so they can be transformed by their experience and relationship with God, so that the church can be transformed by the newly included group. Right. How do you think churches best go about this? And do you have any examples of the kind of positive transformation, based maybe on this queer virtue, that is possible for communities who seek this path?
Yeah. I think, one of the premises of my work is that I think that all of us, in our particularities, bring information about God to bear. I think in our particularities, each one of us, we've learned things about who God is and how God operates in the world. And I think it would be good for churches generally to make room for those voices and listen carefully to them. Not as a gesture of being sort of polite or nice or inclusive, but with this kind of hunger to understand God in our midst better, So I think it would be valuable broadly for church communities to be intentional and maybe even aggressive, not aggressive in a bad way, but hungry, hungry to hear what those experiences are and to bring people into conversation about that. Now, so you asked about examples. I heard there was a church here in the States. I don't know this church. I heard about it because a reporter called me to comment on it. But it was a church that was doing a special service for Good Friday, and they had invited trans people to lead this service. I suspect it was trans-created, but I don't know that. But the idea was that the leadership for the service was going to be trans-led, and that this would be an opportunity for trans people to talk about what is happening on Good Friday through the lens of trans experience. So, and this is gorgeous, right? Because the point here is not a whole bunch of sort of like, liberal, nice people like, oh, I want to understand trans people. It's more like, no, what can trans experience tell us about one of the holiest days, one of the most sacred days of our church year, So I loved that. And I thought, now, honestly, this is what you don't hear these stories very often. And I was really surprised that this church had done this. So I think it would be great to do more of that. As a model, there are churches that, while there are churches that come into being looking through a particular lens of experience, and get accustomed to being able to do that. And it may be looking particularly through a queer lens. I'm really lucky to count as my altar home, altar, ALTAR. My altar home is the church of, it's an Episcopal church, St. Andrew and Holy Communion in South Orange, New Jersey. And it's a predominantly African-American and Caribbean church. And this is a place where folks are, pay a lot of attention to an African-American and Caribbean perspective on what's going on in the gospel and what's going on in the world. And when I preach there, that's I sort of listen for, okay, what might the perspective of a person of color be on what we're talking about here right now. What I found with this church is that I can also bring my queer lens to bear, and the folks in this church are incredibly able to hear that and grapple with it. And there are folks in the church who are LGBT, as well. But my experience is that this idea of listening through different lenses, you can practice that and get better at it, and that there are models that exist for it.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's really good. And as you say, it's one of those things that comes in not only for the queer community, but for other communities, as we try to listen to Indigenous voices, and people of color, things like that.
Yes. Immigrant experiences, I think all the time about what it's like to realize in the middle of the night that you got to go. And you pack up your stuff, whatever you can carry, and you've probably been thinking about this for a while, and you grab your kids and you leave, and you've got this little window of time to make some kind of escape and follow some kind of plan. Hopefully that you make it, and hopefully the boat gets across the sea, or whatever it is that happens. If you survive an experience like that, you learn something about God. And I think people who have been through that know something about God that I don't know, but not just something that's true for them, something that's true for everybody.
Yeah, 100%. That's great. Yeah. So early on in your book, you highlight 3 distinguishing truth claims within Christianity. I'll just look at it. That God came to earth in the person of Jesus, that Jesus Christ was killed, died, and rose from the dead, and that it is possible for any human being to perceive these truths and join or form a community that worships this God, following the ethical path laid out by Jesus. So that'll preach. So each of these truths, you say, dramatically and decisively rupture a binary that was previously thought inviolable.
Right.
Great, again. And loving it. I'm all over it. So this leads to your claim about the inherent queerness of Christianity. Do you want to maybe speak a little to that? And then I'm really interested to how do you think we can best practice or perform this binary rupturing, whether it be just where our community gathers, or through liturgy or sermons? How do you think this happens?
Yeah. Well, I think the best way to do that in liturgy is to look for it, because it abounds in liturgy. In preaching, it's it's actually super easy. Once you start looking for this, through this lens of queerness, this business about rupturing binaries is all over the place. And in fact, I am finding, I made it a discipline a few years ago that, do you all follow the lectionary?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay. I made it a discipline that when I was handed one of those texts, and I don't mean the clobber passages, I just mean anything that's like difficult, anything that's like wailing and gnashing of teeth or whatever it is. I made it this policy for myself. I'm going to take it on. I'm not, that's what Phyllis Tribble was my teacher at Union Seminary, and that's what she taught me. Wrestle with scripture, So, and what I found in that was that very often what's going on in these texts that are the most difficult or the most misunderstood is some rupturing that's happening. And as I tell the story in the book about preaching on the wedding at Cana, which is, oh my God, it's in the wedding liturgy in the Episcopal Church, right? It's in the Book of Common Prayer, cited as Jesus giving his imprimatur to weddings. So it's always been, for those of us who long, were or have been excluded from that institution, just painful. So I started to look at this text, I'm like, oh God, digging. And all of a sudden somehow or another, my attention got shifted to those pots of water that he turns into wine. I'm thinking, what are those anyway? And what they are is they're these pots of water that get used for cleansing rituals. They get used in mikvahs, which are ritualistic baths that designed to sort of like cleanse you of impurities. And what he does is he takes this water that's designed to sort of separate out the clean from the unclean, the pure from the impure, and he turns it into wine that we're all supposed to share, And of course, everybody's already completely sauced at this wedding, that's kind of the point, right? And so all this is going to do is sort of continue to blur those, harsh edges of our lives, it's it's just blurring. So what I see going on there is Jesus queering these pots of water. And all of a sudden, this story, which has always felt like a weapon against me and my people, right? All of a sudden it becomes this amazing demonstration of Jesus taking the stuff that pits us against each other and converting it into something completely different, or maybe inverting it into sort of the exact opposite. So anyway, I just think scripture there's just so much that is rich in that. And that's the kind of thing that I mean, where, when I say that I think that there is hope here to do something about tepid proclamation, when you look at it through that lens, it's so exciting. There's just so much to talk about. So that's one place. And then there are lots of places loaded. Preaching is one place. And then there are the other, places throughout a liturgy where you could just lift them up, spend time with them, right? In Anglican tradition, when we are at the table, there's this moment that we call epiclesis. Do you know epiclesis? Have you ever
Oh. I should. I'm blanking on the spot.
So epiclesis is a very Anglican Catholic kind of thing. But what it is when you're you're standing at the table, right? The priest is standing at the table, and you've got the wine and the bread, set on the table there, right? And there's this moment where you invoke the Holy Spirit, and you ask the Holy Spirit to come and be present in these elements, and you ask the Spirit to come down and sanctify these elements, right? And so you do a cross thing, right? It's called epiclesis, and the idea is that the Holy Spirit actually shows up, and goes come in, into this stuff to make it we don't believe in transubstantiation in the Anglican Church. So for us, it doesn't become Christ's body and blood, but that is what it becomes in Catholicism. But we do believe that something happens there. This mystery happens there. Well, it's absolutely this. It's the essence of sort of rupturing this. Okay, there's God up there, and there's us down here. And it's this, this mingling thing that happens. So there are these really wonderful moments where I think a lot of times folks don't even necessarily know what's going on at that moment in the liturgy, but we could talk about that more, and spend time with that moment and observe it. And there are just lots and lots of those. Yeah. The other thing is, real quick thing that it's throw in here is that I'm involved with a project right now. We did a thing called Glitter Ash Wednesday. And now we're doing one on Pentecost, and the idea is to take these days and look at how queerness informs them, and that you can do that. I could talk about that, but glitter and fire is what Pentecost will be. But it's designed to be a substantive theological approach that also is queer positive. And digs in to see what can queerness tell us about what God is up to in this moment.
I love that. Yes, I saw today. I think I got the newsletter today from the Queer Virtue send down, which had a bit about that. So yeah, that looks so exciting. Yeah. Another really beautiful passage in the book. I'll just read out. We're talking about the introduction of queer identity as a spiritual journey and vocation. So you have here, queer individuals are called to perceive a truth inside of themselves, name it as an identity marker, reckon with it, tell the truth about it, even in the face of hostility, find others who perceive a comparable identity marker, and build a community for the betterment of all of us. That, to me, is the essence of a spiritual journey. It is more than that. In my faith tradition, we refer to this as a call. It is a vocation. So I imagine that's a powerful realization to make for your own life and your own ministry. And I hope it's one that will come to be shared by others. What do you think it means, maybe first for a member of the LGBTQ community, and maybe second for an ally, straight ally, to recognize this powerful and deeply spiritual nature of queer identity?
Yeah. I say in the introduction that a chief goal for me in writing the book is to spread balm on the vast wounds of my people. And my experience in talking about this is that very often queer people hear these ideas and they sort of have two simultaneous reactions that's almost conflict but don't. And that is, on the one hand, yes, I see what you're saying here. Yes, and at the same time, I've never thought about it that way. It's like this aha moment of, because it automatically kind of undoes so much of I don't know if it undoes damage, but I do think that it shows the loose threads in the arguments that are used to make us feel awful about ourselves, so part of what has been a gift to me in this work is that it's so clear that not only does the message resonate and take people by surprise, but to hear this come from a priest is a really big deal. When I started writing the book, I was so committed to the idea that the church needs to be so much stronger in our proclamation. And now that I've taken this, traveled around talking with people about the book, it's just so clear how much good we could do, literally how many lives we could save by being out there, in a powerful way, showing the resonance between this queer path and the Christian path. And just simply looking at queer experience and saying, look at how extraordinary this is, You asked, Liam, you asked earlier about my goals for the book, and I would give a great deal to be able to take this message to, like, individually, personally, to, like, every queer person I could find, and say just that, look at you, and I think it's worth noting here that I think sometimes allies of LGBTQ people are actually ahead of queer people ourselves on this front, because there's no question that one of the reasons we've made such strides in the past few decades is because of the allies, parents and friends and family members, who have themselves dismantled these violent, spiritually violent messages, because they hear this message, and then they look at the queer person in their life, and very often see someone who's a really good person, and the dissonance can't stand. If you've got somebody's preaching an idea at you and it doesn't jibe with reality, what you're going to go with is you're talking about this person, but this is this person, and so I think that there are allies who already have this strong sense that there's something in this life, in this call, that is remarkable, and then the idea that is actually vocational. It's sort of I think that's sort of a natural, step. It's like, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One final question, if you have the time. In the book, you write about your own priesthood. And also you then later in the book return to the priesthood equality of queer people.
Yeah.
Could you expand a little into your insights into priesthood? Because I found this a especially interesting concept, and so perhaps priesthood and the way that it intersects with queer ethics.
Yeah. So this is based on my whole take on priesthood actually was handed to me in this wonderful way by a dear friend of mine years and years ago. And her definition of priest is that a priest is someone who stands in a place of remarkable vulnerability, and by doing so, invites other people to enter the sacred. It's long been true that there's this concept of the iconic priesthood, the idea that we're all supposed to be priests in some way. We all reflect. We reflect God, we embody God, and we all are capable of doing this business of standing in a place of vulnerability and then inviting people into the sacred. The idea of the iconic priesthood is that people who are ordained are sort of lifted up in a special way, sort of modeling quite visibly the lives that we are called to lead. And obviously different priests do that with different levels of success or not. And I can't boast of being flawless in it at all. But I do see part of the point of the book is to say that I see in queer experience a priestliness, in that sense of modeling something that I think we can all learn from, and when I say we all, what I really mean, I think everybody could learn from this, but definitely Christians could pay close attention and learn a great deal about who we are as priests and how we can be that better. But there's another way that I think queer people live into a kind of priestliness. There's a chapter in the book on risk. You laid out sort of the steps of this ethical path that I see, and the ethical path, and you named it, is you have to discern an identity. You have to tell the truth about it, even when it entails risk and requires courage. You have to find other people, engage with other people, discerning a similar identity marker. And then you build community, and then we're supposed to look to the margins and see who's still struggling and do something about that. Well, that step that is the step of risk, that's for queer people, that's about coming out. I think for Christians, that's what evangelism is supposed to be, not beating people over the head with, bad news, but in fact, telling something that is good news. This is my good news, and I just want to tell you about it. You don't have to do anything. This is not about changing you. This is just this thing in my life that's so marvelous that in order to talk about me, I have to tell you about it. And it's a kind of coming out, right? Well, so there's this chapter on risk, and I explore both sides of coming out as queer, coming out as Christian. But there's this, and that chapter on the queer side spends a bit of time, looking at the real price that queer people pay for being out. The material cost of it. Which can be, it can be financial, it can be physical, it can be, these are life and death issues for a lot of people still all over the world. Terrible stories right now coming out of Chechnya, the men who are being brutalized there. So these are life and death issues. And I have spent a good bit of time pondering why do we do this? And I think that the answer is rooted in a kind of hope that has everything to do with knowing that that the risk I take is not just about me. That even if I pay a price for this, there is something larger at stake, right? And that is an insight that is not confined to queer people. There's a great movie about apartheid, where this young black man comes to testify and someone says, "Why did you do this?" And he's like, "They can only pile up so many bodies before things have to change." So he knows he's risking his life. So there are lots of different kinds of people who understand what this is. But my point here is that when you start to talk about there is something at work that is bigger than me, then you are gesturing toward the transcendent. And for those of us who believe in God, that's what that is, and that's priestly to me, that gesture of transcendence.
Wow, that's a very good place to end. So, Liz Edman, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. People, go out and check out and buy and read and rate and review 5 stars, Queer Virtue. Check it out.
In paperback. It's in paperback.
Yes,
now.
Yeah. You don't need this one that knocks on wood. Yeah, you can get paperback, get it out, pick it up. It's a really good read. It's something that we definitely need to be engaging with more and more, and it's beautifully written. And Elizabeth Edman, thank you so much. Is there other ways that people can connect with you or support the work of Queer Virtue or your work otherwise?
Absolutely. So I've got a website, and it's just queervirtue.com. I've got a .org website that's not up and running yet. Because there's a movement that's happening in all of this. And on the queervirtue.com website, you can sign up for that email list the email that you just got today. You can follow me on Twitter. It's Liz_Edman. And there's a Queer Virtue Facebook page as well.
There you go. Yeah, we look forward to discussing this in groups. So we'll see everyone around campus. And if you're watching this elsewise, thanks, and consider sharing it around. Liz, thank you so much again for being here today. And
I'm delighted, Liam.
No worries.
Thank you. All right. Take care.